Okay, so good afternoon to all. It's with a great pleasure that I welcome you here to the second edition of the Sustainability Lunch Talks, this time dedicated to the environmental impacts of agriculture and our food practices. So I'm Laurent Bétry, I'm the Sustainability Officer at the University of Luxembourg. I'm in charge of integrating sustainability into the operations and functioning of the university. For this, I coordinate reflections and actions to develop specific responses at the university to the challenges of ecological transition, and one of the facets of my actions involves raising awareness at the university community of the various themes of sustainability. It is for this reason that with members of the Sustainability Coordination and Expertise Group, professors, researchers, administrative staff, and members of the delegations, we have launched this series of discussions. This series is for everyone, committed or not. It aims to restore the facts in the mass of information that is about sustainability. And this is why we invite recognized researchers to inform us in a short and interactive format on the contributions of science to the questions we wish to address. Today, we will tackle a very important topic for our societies, food. Food is vital for our bodies, for our organizations, but despite all the benefits it brings, food has also significant impacts on our environment and on our ecosystems. To talk about it, we have Dr. Elorri Igos, R&T Associates at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, which we all know as LIST. Elorri is a specialist in the environmental impact evaluations of products and services based on the life cycle assessment methodology. And this webinar is co-hosted and moderated by Dr. Rachel Reckinger from the university, who leads at the Faculties of Humanities and Science of Education the project called Sustainable Food Practices. She's also a member of the National Higher Council for Sustainable Development. Before handing over to Rachel, I would like to point out that I may intervene later in the presentation as a timekeeper to prevent us from going over the 1 hour slot we have set ourselves. So Rachel, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Laurent, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here today with you at this Sustainability Lunch Talk on the environmental impact of our food. And I'd like to give a brief overview to contextualize our guest speakers' talk in order to frame the urgency of the topic. The ongoing systemic issues around climate change, environmental degradation, rates of hunger and malnutrition, as well as rising public health issues, all related to food, have recently been enhanced by elements that first the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine have made widely visible in general for the public. In various degrees of inequality, we all depend on fragile, because highly concentrated and highly interwoven, interrelations in long and partly unethical supply chains. So there's something wrong in our food systems. A compelling representation of the current state of global food systems is the donut economics model, where the inner ring, as you can see here, represents a social foundation consisting of minimum social standards such as access to balanced food, health, education, political voice, gender equality, etc. The outer ring is illustrating the ecological ceiling beyond which lie planetary boundaries, tipping points, unacceptable environmental degradation. The task is now to prevent social shortfall and ecological overshoot, because we are already today trespassing both the social foundations and the environmental ceiling, meaning that deep inequalities of income, gender, and power are the causes for millions of people living below every dimension of the social foundation. And at the same time, environmental ceilings are already being crossed for at least 4 dimensions, particularly climate change, nitrogen use, change of lands use, and biodiversity loss. So to tackle these issues, one immediately wonders who should bring about this requested transition towards a safe, healthy, and just food system. By empirically qualifying foodscapes, we as researchers can enhance conscience of the key actors and interrelations in order to foster holistic solutions and equitable participation. Specifically, we need coherent and consistent collaborations between food supply circuit actors involved in the production, processing, selling, etc. of food on one hand, and also broader food system actors who actively shape the food supply circuit and its impact with the activities of governance, of education, not-for-profit, and also business interests, citizen commitment, etc. on the other hand. All of these actors need to transition at their respective levels and with their possible scope of action in the four main domains of sustainability. So environmental regeneration at the various phases of production, processing, and consumption of food, social well-being for improved equity and ethics, coherent governance at political and company level, as well as economic well-being, giving financial stability. So today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Elorri Igos, who will go into depth about the methods of assessing, in particular, one of those four sustainability domains, which is the environmental impact of food. Elorri, the floor is yours.
Yes,
yeah, I'm sorry.
I forgot to unmute me. Thank you, Rachel, for the introduction. I guess you can see my full screen now, the presentation. Okay, so indeed, we will talk today about the environmental impact of our food. And when we speak about environmental impact, there is one key indicator, which is the carbon footprint, because it's a global challenge and an indicator that is used by companies or policymakers. We'll speak about other environmental indicators, but first I would like to introduce what is the carbon footprint. So in this graph on the x-axis, we can see the cumulative emission of carbon dioxide, and on the y-axis, the temperature change since the pre-industrial period at the end of the 19th century, when we started discovering fossil fuels. And what we can see, and I guess you might already know, is that the more we emit carbon dioxide, the warmer is our planet. And today we are about 1.3 degrees of global warming, and we can already feel the consequences of this climate change. And if we continue like this, by the end of the century, we could be above 4 degrees of global climate change. So this will have dramatic consequences on our lives, because there will be regions that are not livable anymore due to the droughts or the fact that we cannot cultivate anymore, or there is the increase of sea levels and so on. So it's billions of lives that are in danger with such dramatic climate change. So we need to mitigate this. And for that, we need to make extreme efforts to stay below 2 degrees of global warming, which is the target set during the Paris Agreement, and ideally stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming. So this is a very challenging effort we need to do, but it also means, as you can see on the graph, that we cannot overpass a certain amount of carbon dioxide emission. So it means that we have a certain carbon budget. So now let's try to understand how do we emit carbon dioxide. So as I already mentioned, the main source of CO2 emission are due to the burning of fossil fuels. So you have first coal in black, the main source, then you have oil in blue, and natural gas in gray. So this is more or less 75% of the CO2 emission on Earth. Then you have a small orange bar, which is the direct CO2 emission from chemical process, in particular for cement production. And then in green, the deforestation. So when we cut a tree, we release the carbon that was stored in this tree. But it's not the only greenhouse gas. We have also what we call fluorinated gases that you have in your fridge or your air conditioning system. And then we have dinitrogen oxide, N2O, and methane, CH4, that are gases that are mostly emitted in agriculture. We will see that later. So when we calculate a carbon footprint, we want to consider all greenhouse gas emission. And for that, we need a common unit, which is the kilogram of CO2 equivalent. Basically, we are comparing the ability of greenhouse gas to trap the heat in the atmosphere with the one of carbon dioxide for a period of 100 years. So for example, methane has a factor of 34, so it traps 34 times more heat than carbon dioxide for a period of 100 years. So now, we do not really, for example, burn coal in our house, but this coal is used to, for example, produce electricity, which is then used in various devices and equipments, which finally are used to satisfy our daily needs in terms of mobility or the production of the goods that we consume or the food that we eat. And you see this network is in fact the image of a carbon footprint is to track all the greenhouse gas emissions that were emitted to supply a certain product or a certain services. And we express this carbon footprint in kilogram of CO2 equivalent. So we have done the exercise of calculating the carbon footprint of the average consumption of a Luxembourg resident. So it's divided in 5 categories. The main one is the transport, and especially the use of the car. So even if we remove the transborder effect and the fuel tourism, Luxembourgish people use a lot their car to drive and so on. And of course, when we drive our car, which are mostly diesel or gasoline, we emit CO2 due to the combustion of these fossil fuels. Then comes from the housing category, and here we have mostly carbon greenhouse gas emission due to the use of space heating, which again relies mostly on the burning of fossil fuels, in priority natural gas. Then comes the food sector. So here it's mostly driven by the consumption of animal products. We will see that later. Then the consumption goods, so all the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted to produce the clothes that we buy, the hygiene products, and so on. And finally, the public services, because as a citizen, we also benefit from the functioning of the hospitals, the schools, the police, and so on. And we allocate the greenhouse gas emission of these services to one citizen, one resident. So here in the total, food represents 19%, so it's a quite significant contribution. And if we sum everything, we obtain about 13 tons of CO2 equivalent per inhabitant per year. While if we want to respect the Paris Agreement, we should be below 2 tons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. So it's a huge decrease we need to face. And today we will try to see how we can reduce this greenhouse gas emission in the food sector. So I will start with the impacts of agriculture. So why focusing on agriculture? As you can see in this graph, this is the carbon footprint of the average food consumption in Europe per inhabitant. And the emission from the agriculture accounts for 2/3 of the total carbon footprint. So it's really a lot. Then the remaining third is divided into the production process, so the slaughtering, the processing of food is 11%. Then the transport 8%, the packaging 6%, and then comes the consumers, us. So we use the food, so we use, for example, our cars to go to the shop, we put the food in the fridge, we cook. So this use phase is only 4%. And then the end of life of our food, so if we produce food waste or via our excrement, this is 4% of the total carbon footprint. So now we will focus on agriculture. So why agriculture is emitting so many greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a scheme of a farm. Don't look at all the arrows. I will just focus on the ones that are the most important. So the first main source of greenhouse gas emission in agriculture at global scale is the emission of methane, CH4. So it's 35% coming from the enteric fermentation. So this is the digestive process of animals, and in particular ruminants like cows and sheep. So when they take the food, the digestion process will transform the carbon and re-emit in a methane form via the blurbs or the farts. Then 1/3 is due to the dinitrogen oxide emission from the soil. So what is this process? In fact, to cultivate a crop, we need to feed them with nutrients, in particular nitrogen. But part of this nitrogen is re-emitted as dinitrogen oxide, and it's a powerful greenhouse gas. Then comes the energy consumption, 70% for the machine to heat the greenhouse and so on. And then the manure management, because the manure will emit in particular methane and dinitrogen oxide. when it's stored, when it's transported, when it's also transformed into biogas, you will have some leakage of methane and so on. So the rest is only 3%. So here we have the source of greenhouse gas emission from agriculture and what we can do to reduce this emission. So first, let's look at crops cultivation. I will just show you some examples, not all the practice that can improve the carbon footprint of agriculture. But let's start with crop diversification. When you have different types of crops, you have different types of roots in the soil that can better store the carbon in the soil. So they need less nutrients from additional fertilizer. So you will use less nitrogen-based fertilizer and you will emit less dinitrogen oxide. So this is one way. The other way is to avoid tillage. So here you have 3 pictures of conventional tillage, reduced tillage, or no tillage. So why do we use tillage? Is to reduce the weeds on the field. And for that you use machines, but you also release the carbon that was previously sequestered in the soil. So let's look a bit at the numbers for the example of maize production. Here we see the different usage of herbicides and diesel for the 3 practices. And what we can see with no tillage, we use less diesel because we use less machines, but we increase a bit the use of herbicides to compensate the fact that we still need to treat the weeds. In terms of the carbon balance, here the total area of the bar is the carbon dioxide emissions. So they are slightly lower for the no tillage here because of the lower use of diesel. But then we sequester more carbon. So the light blue bar here is a negative bar, thanks to the fact that we do not reverse the soil. So at the end, when we do the net, so the difference between the emission and the sequestrated carbon, we have a reduction of about 60% of the net carbon footprint compared to the conventional tillage. So of course, we need to see how to avoid the trade-off with the herbicides used, but this is a potential good practice. So now, in fact, I wanted to use Mentimeter, so you can go with your phone or your computer to menti.com, and normally you will have a code to enter, and the code, I put it in the chat, but it's also here on the screen, 13394902. And if you access it, if you have problem, maybe you can write in the chat, I don't know. But the question is about deforestation, in fact. So in 2015, oil palm and soy replaced respectively 11 and 8 million hectares of forest. What about cattle? So either 5 million, 15 million, 25 million, or 45 million of hectares. So basically, we're speaking about the biggest reasons of deforestation. So let's see if you think that cattle is more or less than oil, palm oil and soy. So let's wait a bit and we will see the answer later. So maybe I just wait again for a few seconds. It's quite, yeah, shared. Okay, maybe we can stop, but okay, the majority 25 million, but then next 45, nobody thinks it's 5 million. So let's see, the right answer is indeed 45 million of hectares. So it's huge. And you can see here on the map that this deforestation happened mainly in Latin America and a bit Southeast Asia. So how can we improve the carbon footprint of livestock production? So one practice which is always leading to benefits is to improve pasture management and therefore avoid this deforestation, because when we deforest, we release this capture carbon in the soil. So this could lead to a carbon footprint reduction of 10 to 50% based on a meta-analysis of Poren and Mechek. So it also means we switch from an extensive system to an intensive system, so less square meter for one animal, which can also raise other issues related to the well-being of the animals. And I wanted to show you the results of this study about beef production in Italy that compares these two systems, intensive versus extensive. So when we are in an extensive system, we need less crops because we use the grass. So the feed production impact, we still use a bit of crops, of course, but the yellow bar here is smaller than in the intensive system. On the other side, eating grass is more intense for the digestive system of the animal. So you will have more enteric emission when the animal eats grass. So this blue bar here is higher for the extensive system. So we have these two effects that compensate more or less each other. It's difficult to say what is the best in absolute, but we need to be aware that it's not all black or all white. And I wanted to show this fact to a bit think about the discussion we have when we speak about switching from intensive to extensive system. So now I will speak about various consumer choices and see what are the environmental impacts. So let's start with organic food. So just a small reminder of what is organic food. You cannot use synthetic pesticides or fertilizer. So it doesn't mean you don't use them at all, pesticide or fertilizer, but they are non-synthetic. Then the antibiotics are restricted, GMOs are not allowed, and crops are rotated. So you have the European label, but you have also a national label I'm showing here. And just a number, in Luxembourg, it's about 4% of the farms that are organic, a bit below the European average. But there is a very high demand in Luxembourg, so 80% of the organic food is imported. So now what are the impacts of organic farming? I will show you the results of a meta-analysis that compare organic versus conventional farms for different types of food. So here we are looking at the ratio between the two. So when this ratio is above 1, it means that organic farming is worse. And when it's below 1, it means organic farming is better. So when we look at greenhouse gas emission, we can see that the conclusion is not really clear, also considering the uncertainty, except maybe for the fruits, the green bar here, it seems that it's better. For the land use, however, there is clearly a disadvantage for organic farming. Why is that? Statistically, organic farming will have a lower yield. It means that you need more square meter for the same amount of crops at the end. So this is a disadvantage. But of course, we can look at other environmental indicators. You have the toxicity-related indicators for which normally you will have significant benefits for organic farming. And we can also mention the benefits on ecosystem services, like the fact that they provide habitat for pollinators or better soil quality. Now let's speak about local food. So as I previously a bit mentioned for the organic food, Luxembourg is highly dependent on imports. The only exception is for meat products. Here, our demand is satisfied by 62% from local production. And now if we remind a bit the global picture I show you at the beginning at a European scale, transport, so the logistic parts represents only 8% of the carbon footprint of food in Europe. So we need to be aware that we are playing only on this 8% when we want to play on the transport of food. But of course, this 8% is an average. Depending on the products, you can have a different share of the transport impacts. So here I'm showing the example of 4 food ingredients. Each time you have the total carbon footprint, which is divided into the different processes, and in gray is the transport part. So the contribution of transport impact is represented here just above the bar. So for meat products, the transport share will be very low because the green bar here, the impacts due to the agriculture are so high that the transport contribution is very small. However, it's not the case for vegetable or fruits. And here I wanted to show you the example of bananas, which has a very low carbon footprint for the agriculture, but quite high for transport. So transport represents 43% of the carbon footprint of a banana. But having this high transport share doesn't mean that bananas have a high carbon footprint. We can see here that the carbon footprint of banana is still lower than the one of tomatoes, tofu, or pig meat. So I wanted to show you this graph to tell you that transport cannot be the key element to make a sustainable choice for food consumption. Now I wanted to show you the example of a study about what if we buy national products, and this study focused on the consumption of lettuce in UK. So if we have similar practice, so these two first bars are the cultivation of lettuce in open field in UK or in Spain. And we can see that the fact that we consume the lettuce from Spain increase a bit the carbon footprint, even if there are still a bit of uncertainties, because we have a higher transport impact and the production are more or less similar. But if you buy your lettuce off season, it will be produced in a heated greenhouse. And even if you have a low impact of transport, the agriculture impact will be very high because we consume a lot of fossil energy when we buy off season. So the conclusion is we cannot always draw conclusion only based on transport. We need really to look at the agricultural practice, the yields, and so on. But if you want to buy local, it's really important to combine it with seasonal products, and it will have higher consequences if it's on fruits and vegetables rather than on meat. So now let's look at packaging. So again, if you remind the first global picture I show you, packaging was responsible of 6% of the carbon footprint of food consumption in Europe. And I wanted to start with the fact that what is the function of packaging? The function is to preserve and protect food. So normally the impact of packaging will be much smaller than the impacts of food production. So the ratio here of food production over packaging impacts is above 1. And I can show you the results for different food products from a study. We can see it's always above 1 and even sometimes above 100. So the conclusion from this first introduction is that we always need to avoid food waste rather than trying to reduce packaging that could have a trade-off on food waste. So this is really important, that let's protect food as a key priority to avoid this food waste rather than trying to avoid useful packaging. But can we still reduce packaging impact? Here I'm showing the results of a study in Germany about packaging-free supermarkets. They looked at 6 products, and out of these 6, there was an advantage on the carbon footprint of 30% reduction for 4 of these products, but there were 2 exceptions for which it was not the case. For fruit bears, because here you will use a reusable packaging that you need to clean quite intensively each time before you go back to the supermarket. So the cleaning impacts are too high compared to the production of single-use packaging. And the tofu, because here clients will use glass packaging, which is quite heavy and more impacting than the single film, thin film, that is usually put on tofu. So speaking about reusable packaging, we need to bear in mind that the impacts of producing a reusable packaging are always higher than the impacts of producing a single-use packaging. Why? Because it's heavier, it's more complex, it's more robust. So the fact that we produce it are more impacting than the impacts of producing a single use. But after a second use, a third use, each time you will need to produce again a single-use packaging, so the impacts will increase each time linearly, while for the reusable packaging, you will have a smaller slope because you only have the impacts of cleaning, or if you don't clean at all, you have a flat slope. But at a certain point, these two slopes these two lines will cross, and reusable packaging will become better than single use. So this is the break-even point, the minimum number of use you need to reuse your reusable packaging to be better than the single use. So here, some example of a study about beverage cup in Europe. So the single-use packaging is here a paper cup, and they calculated that for a plastic reusable cup, they needed to use at least 20 times, for a steel cup at least 130 times, and for a ceramic cup at least 350 times. So you really need to avoid to break the ceramic cup before this number. So this is just to show you that it's important to, when we do reusable packaging, to exploit a maximum this reusable packaging, to take care about it, and not just to multiply the number of reusable packaging you have in your house. So now let's speak about the diet. So here we have the European average diet in terms of mass and carbon footprint. So clearly what we can see is that the meat represents more or less 10–50% of the mass we ingest, but more than 50% of our carbon footprint. So we clearly need to reduce our meat consumption, and not only for the planet, but also for our health. Because, for example, in Luxembourg and in Europe, we eat meat, we eat more than 200 grams of meat per day, while just for dietary recommendations, so just for our health, we should eat less than 100 grams of meat per day, and some countries even recommend to eat less than 50 grams of meat per day. So this value will change a bit depending on the country. And here we can clearly see the reason. So I'm looking at the carbon footprint of protein-based ingredients. So it's the kilogram of CO2 equivalent per 100 grams of protein. And here you see at the top, the ones that have the smaller carbon footprint is the plant-based ingredients. So we really need to switch from animal-based to plant-based protein. So it has co-benefits, the use of plant-based ingredients, but sometimes there is also some trade-off. And I wanted to show you here the potential trade-off on water scarcity, especially for the consumption of nuts. So we have here a quite high impact on water scarcity, mainly due to the production of almonds in area like USA, where there is a high water stress, and this is why this value is so high here. But in general, there are mostly co-benefits. So now, in terms of carbon footprint, so here I'm showing you the results of a German study and an American study with the different types of diet. And so if we follow dietary recommendations, so in Germany, there are 2 recommendations of 40 or 64 grams of meat per day. So we can reduce by 10 to 20% of our carbon footprint, more or less. Then if we go to full vegetarian or vegan, it's a reduction of 30 to 50%, depending exactly on what we eat. It's difficult to have a precise estimation, but it's quite significant. And as I say, there are co-benefits on other indicators on our health. Of course, we need to look at the trade-offs, but on water scarcity and on our health, on the potential lack of vitamin B12, especially for vegan diet. But still, it is a change that we need to engage. And to finish, I wanted to speak about food waste. And you can, again, start your Mentimeter. And the question is, what is the amount of food waste generated worldwide? Is it 10%, 25%, 33%, or 50% of the food that we produce? So this is at global scale. Okay, you are very pessimistic about the functioning of the of the world. 50%, okay, yeah. Okay, maybe just a few seconds more if you want. Nobody wants to answer 10%. Okay, let's switch back. But most of you, in fact, had the right answer, which is 1/3. So it's huge. It's really a huge amount of waste that we waste. And in terms of carbon footprint, it's about 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So if it was a country, it would be the 3rd most higher emitter country, just after China and US. So at Luxembourgish scale, there is a study that was performed. So there is about 118 kilograms of food waste per person per year. And most of these waste are generated at household and smaller part at restaurants, canteen, and retailer. And if we look at the graph here, so we have 2 columns, one for the proportion in terms of mass of the different food categories, and then in terms of carbon footprint, both for Europe and Luxembourg. And clearly, as we observe for the diet, we do not waste too much meat, but this is the main source of greenhouse gas because the production impact of meat are very high. And it was estimated that about 40% of our waste could be avoided, so we could really decrease this amount of 330 kilograms of CO2 equivalent that we emit due to food waste in Luxembourg. So now I wanted to finish with this last slide. So it might be a bit subjective, but I just wanted to reflect the main action we can do at consumer level to reduce the carbon footprint of our food. So here you see on the y-axis what is the expected reduction on our carbon footprint for the food, and here the other environmental benefits. So the best to do is here on the top right is to adapt our diet, and in particular to reduce drastically our consumption of animal products, and in particular beef. So even if it's Luxembourgish beef, I'm sorry to say that we really need to minimize this consumption. Then avoiding food waste is a key action to mitigate our carbon footprint. And then here we have actions that are more discutable because it depends on how they are done. So reusable packaging is a good option, and it could have significant benefits on our carbon footprint, but we need to do it well. So reuse a maximum of the packaging and avoid to clean it a lot each time. Organic food, we have seen that it's not really an advantage on carbon footprint, but more on other environmental indicators. And then local food alone cannot really tell you if it's good or not. But if you combine, for example, local food with seasonal food, then you have a benefit. So this is why I've put this action here. And with that, I would like to finish my presentation, and let's see if you have question.
Thank you very much, Elorri, for a fascinating talk. And now, while our attendees are likely to be busy typing in their burning questions and comments into the chat, I propose to open the Q&A session with a comment that puzzled me most in your presentation, which is the relatively limited impact of organic agriculture according to the life cycle assessment methods. And I'd like to bring in two elements. On one hand, if one adds more indicators than greenhouse gas emissions into the equation, such as ecosystem services, job creation, cultivation of common circular farm management, biodiversity, soil regeneration, what else could we think of, diversified cropping systems, etc., then organic agriculture yields a more prominent result. So that's the one thing. And on the other hand, the gap between organic and conventional agriculture increases also if the production methods are modified, and specifically if livestock is reduced, freeing land and resources for plant-based resources. So it seems to me that for systemic problems, we also need systemic methodologies of analysis that combine the assets of various approaches. And we also need an equally holistic reshaping of the initial agricultural production processes that are then being analyzed by those systemic methods. So that was a first comment. But I can see there's more in the chat. Do you want to give an answer, Elorri, to this, or shall I?
Okay, I thought okay. Okay, I can start with the first question. Or is this deforestation driven by increased meat consumption? Yeah. So in fact, if we remain the meat consumption constant, we will not deforest more. So it means that we are cutting trees because we want more meat, but also there is in some parts of the world the livestock is only in these extensive farms, so less relying on the crops cultivation. So to have this space available, then they cut trees. So it will be less the case in Europe. Of course, we have seen in the map that we have much less deforestation in Europe, but we have this other practice in the other side of the world. So it's both, I think, driven by the increased meat consumption and the fact that some countries, some developed countries in particular, want to increase their production to have more exports also to us or to other regions of the world. So they want to increase their revenues, so they increase their meat production.
There's another question that asks if less crops lead to more fields dedicated to human consumption. Is this an argument for extensive versus intensive breeds?
But in fact, you will need to still have more space for the grazing. So I'm not sure about this because so if you are in if you need space for pasture for the animals, then you need a lot of square meters that are potentially cultivable land for the crops for humans. So I don't have the data to answer to your question. I don't know, but I think in general, if you have an extensive system, you will use more square meter, even considering the square meters of the crops, because really you will need to have a lot of space. And I think this space could also be used to grow crops for humans, direct consumption. So I'm not sure, but I don't think it's a good argument for extensive system.
We have another question about people asking if you have information about the environmental impacts of cultivated meat, meaning meat grown from cells in bioreactors.
Yeah, I don't have directly. I just saw, maybe as some people here in the audience, some articles showing that cultivated meat is always better than animal meat. But I cannot tell you exactly the environmental impact, how much it decreased, but for sure it will decrease, because we have this methane emission. I mean, they are intrinsic to the livestock production. We cannot reduce, or there are systems that think about how to recover the methane from the animals and so on, but it's quite complex. So, I mean, I know it will be a reduction of impact, but I cannot tell you more.
Yeah, because here Philippe, for instance, explains that cultivated protein still relies on primary source of nitrogen, for instance. So, you know, it's another type of trade-off. So here we have another question, the reverse question in a way. Is there any data how much meat can be produced if we only use land that is not useful for other food and not forests either? So if we only use the land that can strictly only be used by ruminants. Do we have data on that?
No, I'm sorry. I don't know. No. I need also to warn you that I'm not specialist about food, even if this talk is about food impact. My specialty is about, as Laurent and Rachel say, about the environmental impact quantification. So I look for this presentation and other presentation about the food impacts, but I cannot tell you really all these details about the land availability. I don't know. Rachel, if you have any idea, but I don't know.
To my knowledge, there is no study that has identified this kind of land. There are studies that identify the different types of land and obviously also trying to leave the forests as they are and leave the green permanent pastures also unchanged, and then doing modelizations on how much can be yielded in different types of systems, also by reducing the livestock and then having more acre land freed up for plant-based proteins directly for humans, so with the idea of feed no food. But to my knowledge, there is no study that actually focuses on permanent pastures that cannot, be only used by ruminants in that sense. So apart from that, we have another question here saying, besides changing people's mentality to adjust food consumption and avoiding waste, what can be done to convince the production side to shift production and mostly change about packaging choices?
Yeah, so I think yeah, we need to rethink our food production system, of course, really already to think about our agricultural practice. So it's maybe hard to convince farmers to switch from livestock production to plant or crops cultivation, or conventional to organic farming, and so on. And we know that there are also a huge pressure on this food supply chain with the price. So because consumers are now used to pay low price for our food budget has really decreased since several yeah, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years. Really, if we compare the budget of food contribution 50 years ago and today, now it's ridiculous. So I think there is a change to be made, but consumers need also to accept the impact they will have maybe on their budget. And about packaging, there is, yes, the logistic and the supply chain to be rethinked to, well, first avoid useless packaging, because there is for sure useless packaging. So I just saw an example of this Barilla pasta, that they have this plastic film just to show the pasta across the packaging box. Now they remove this. So this is a very simple example that can be done easily by the producer to avoid an additional plastic layer that is not useful, but just is marketing. So as a consumer, we need also to avoid to be too much influenced by the marketing and to still buy these pasta that are in the box where we do not see across the pasta. And this is just a small example, but I'm sure there is a lot of things to be improved. Then packaging, I know that, for example, you will have small, inside the box of biscuits, you will have a small packaging, plastic packaging for like 3 biscuits. This is difficult to decide what is best, because thanks to this smaller packaging in a plastic film, you can avoid the deterioration of the biscuits and so really prolong the lifetime of the food. So we need to be more careful. If we want to reduce packaging, we also need to be more careful on our side to avoid food waste, as I said before in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Here we have another question saying, are there any moves by the Luxembourgish government to create media awareness on the impact of food? And if so, how accessible are these information on the official database and website of the government?
I'm not really aware of that, so I don't know. Hachel, do you have any information about this?
Well, the Ministry of Agriculture is the one that communicates most prominently on this topic, but obviously with an approach that's agriculture driven. And this is, in fact, a very highly relevant question to show that there is a need for policy coherence in these kind of communications and in this awareness raising and didactic needs, because there is effectively a huge need for these kind of incentives, and also bringing about practice change with workshops and with convivial gatherings and so on. So there is a huge field of action that is very necessary here. But for the moment, the government as such is not doing a concerted, coherent policy in this domain. They are in the process of creating a food policy where this is going to be enhanced, hopefully in the future. And there is also the project of creating a food policy council at national level, which would combine stakeholders from governments, but also from the food production sector as a whole, and also from civil society organizations, from citizens, where this collective and participative awareness raising and also testing of practices, experiences would be enhanced. But it's a longer process, and it cannot come only from one side. So it cannot only come from the government or from a particular ministry within the government. So here, other questions. Are the recent laws to ban single-use plastic packaging for food relevant and impactful?
Yeah, so in fact, about single-use plastic, there are many studies about from the UNEP, so the United Nations Environmental Program, that were done to compare the benefits or potential trade-off of the alternative to single-use plastic. And basically, we can conclude that there are good alternatives to switch to other types of materials and reusable packaging, but still with condition to that, as I say. So the condition that we have a minimum number of use, so there are some materials that are better than the other, and so on. But of course, there is another issue that I didn't mention, is the plastic pollution. And today, there are a lot of research work focusing on this plastic pollution to understand first the amount of this plastic pollution, how they how they behave in the environment, and then what is the potential impact on ecosystem or human health. So for now, it's still at the beginning, and we have some proof that there is a potential problem for aquatic ecosystem. As you might know, the degradation of plastic into microplastic or nanoplastic, and the fact that some fish, for example, will stop eat because they have this plastic inside their intestine. So they think they are full, but in fact they will just die. So there is some evidence, but we are not at the state that we can quantify and model this cause-effect chain. So this is a topic, I think, for the future, and still under development. But it's true that this is a big trade-off of plastic materials, and we still need to better understand. We're still not sure, for example, if it's a problem for our health, our human health, or not. We're still not sure about that. But yes, I think it's a good step that we reduce the amount of single-use plastic packaging, but we need to be careful. We need to avoid to have all these dozens of eco bags in our house just because we always forgot the eco bag when we go to the shop. So this is really a bad practice, and we need to avoid this. I know it's I'm personally also guilty, so I don't want to say, yeah, but for sure we need to be careful with this, to be careful with the value of the packaging that we use to replace this single-use plastic packaging.
That's an important point, I think, what you made about the plural use plastics, that it's depending on the amount of usages, and showing that graph. I think that's something that is not widely known to the general public, that where there's more simplistic understanding that single-use plastics are always bad and the other ones are always better, when in fact is a bit more differentiated than that, and it also enhances our own responsibility as well. So here is another question about the quantification. So what do you include in food waste in the figures you presented? Do we consider food waste that are actually diverted towards animal feed or biomass valorization into energy, nutrients, biomaterials, etc.? So how is the figure composed?
So the 1/3 of food waste will be really the total. So part of this 1/3 will be used for animal feeding or so on. Then the Luxembourgish figure of more than 100 kilograms of food waste per inhabitant, it's really at the consumer level. So this is really what we waste at our consumer level. And this, you put it either in the black bin or you put maybe in the composting. So I don't know. I think in Luxembourg it's still not a very deployed practice. I hope it will be more deployed. But anyway, if you put it in the black bin, it will be incinerated, or maybe a part landfill. There will be an energy recovery from this incineration, but still. And then if you go to the composting, then it becomes fertilizer, let's say, for the crop. So this is good. But I was speaking, the more than 100 kilograms is really the food waste that we produce at consumer level. So it's already huge.
Mm-hmm. So here we have also a comment of somebody saying most of the food waste is post-harvest and 40% at retail level before consumers purchase even. So due to large amounts of buying and also to the cold chain storage.
Yeah.
Basically, there's waste at every level of the chain.
Yes, it's more or less as a Sandburg rule. I say about 1/3 of the food waste is at the farm, 1/3 during the processing, the value chain, the supermarkets and so on, and about 1/3 at consumer level. This is the order of magnitude. Of course, we can speak about the real percentage, but more or less it's this. So of course, the consumer are not the only responsible. There is also the responsibility from all the actors in the value chain. But yeah, so it's even worse to waste when we are at consumer level, because we carry the impact of all the food supply chain before. So the agriculture impact, the processing, the transport impact. So when we waste food at consumer level, it's the worst, because you have already done so much impacts to have this food at your level. So it's just a message to say we have something to do at consumer level, but of course all the actors can have a great role to reduce food waste.
And particularly political actors who can bring about more stringent regulations in this domain. It's being said here a bit provocatively, stop giant supermarkets, capitalism is the problem. So there is a possibility to politically intervene to make sure that food is revalorized also when it's coming closer to its best by Sunday. There are possibilities, but they have to be taken.
Sorry. No, in France there is this law, so supermarkets are obliged to give their food losses, let's say, to an association. And I think this would be a great law to implement in Luxembourg also, because it's food that is available, that is we can consume, and there are people that need this food. So I think this law could be very beneficial in Luxembourg.
Which shows, that food policy is a rising domain, because it's intersectoral, and it's the only truly systemic kind of influence that actors can have with an immediate broad result.
So I think that we answered all the questions that we have in the chat. So it's been 1 hour that Elorri and Rachel talk about food. So I suggest that we end the webinar. And it was I would like to thank you very much for your the discussion and the Q&A session. I hope that you enjoyed it. I would like also to invite you already for the third Sustainability Lunch Talk that is scheduled on Wednesday, the 21st of September. This will be the European Mobility Week, so it's quite just that we talk about mobility at that time. Meanwhile, I wish you a happy and restful summer break. And I'm closing the talk by thanking again Dr. Elorri Igos and Dr. Rachel Reckinger for their excellent contributions and the lively discussion that we had. I don't know
Thank you, Laurent. No, thank you, Laurent. Thank you for all being here, and thank you for your comments. It's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. The same.
Thank you. So thank you very much to everybody, and goodbye, and hopefully we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.